was wonderful what you just played.
Well, thanks.
Were you using the crescendo pedal or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just because I don't know the organ that well
Yeah.
yet. So,
For sure, yeah. If you don't have presets, it's kind
Yeah.
of like, what are you gonna do? You know, you can't just stop and
I
look
know.
and.
then, well, it takes so long to get used to the instrument and to be able to play that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it does.
Not like the piano where most of them are pretty similar. It's like every organ is
Yeah.
its own thing. So, nice.
Oh, I forgot when they did this model.
Oh yeah, it's supposed to clip, but it's broken. So.
Oh, okay.
So you can just go ahead and pull the thing down and then set it the music down. Yeah. Awesome.
Well, thanks again. Holy cow.
Oh sure, no problem.
Do they have any kind of like a young adult program in the church at all?
Well, it's funny you'd mention that because have you been to Grace at all?
I think I've been there once.
Because they have a new vicar there. His name is Jeremy Lamont, and he just very recently, like only a couple weeks ago, was trying to start something for younger adults or whatever from, what, I guess, age 20 to 30, I don't know, something like that.
Well, I'm 24, and I'd really like to go to something like that. I know my girlfriend would probably go to something like that, too. Yeah, but he's not mentioned that the Bible is arcane. So.
Yeah, well, I can let you know as soon as he plans some other event. He's only done one event so far, but I think everyone wanted to do another one, so yeah, if he lets me know, I can announce it here.
That'd be great, and I can leave my information, my phone number and stuff with you too.
Yeah, that'd be good, actually. Let's see, just so I have it. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Yeah, that's okay, I'm Josh.
Josh, oh, cool.
Are we recording? Gonna be recording or?
Yes. You have the mic turned on.
We're starting in here. The adult class is starting. Nobody capers. That's what they called me. They called me back in the day, Angel. Okay, so we'll get started. I feel like people don't really even come in until I start talking. I have to actually start before they come, most people come in. So last couple days or weeks, we've been talking a lot about. It's a lot of been. That's it. We've been talking about time and stuff. So we kind of went through the course of that. So one of the things, we're kind of going into a different kind of subject today, in that we're going to be talking a bit about architecture and church symbols and all that. So historically, almost from the very beginning, it just began to develop that Christians started to, they saw art and architecture and how things were built as ways of giving thanks back to God, and also as ways of teaching and so forth. Of course, you could go to Europe and you see this in so many churches, especially if they date back, 1,000 or so years. They wanted to convey something with what the things that they built and the architecture and everything in it. And so also it's a case of what we believe often affects the places where we worship. If we believe that, as the kind of medieval churches did, that God is sovereign and that he is transcendent and that he is Lord of all, your churches their churches reflected that theological ideas in a way. So you walk into a church in England and you have these big vaulted ceilings, and it just feels so much bigger, and it kind of just always makes sure you look up. That's all kind of how architecture and all these things kind of influenced things. Now, if you go to some more modern churches, I was down in Orem yesterday at a conference dedicated to the question of Mormon outreach, and it was at essentially a Baptist church, and it was essentially a kind of a theater stage. And so that's another way in which, especially in our modern days, is because we've become more and more entertainment driven, in which that has kind of invaded its way into the church. So many churches, especially if they've been built in the last 20 or so years, they take this whole approach that makes it feel more like, you're in a concert hall, that things look more like a stage up front. And this all, we might like to think this is all unbiased, but even in a unconscious way, our theology and what we believe about God, or how we think God works in our lives, will ultimately affect the spaces that we dedicate to him. And especially older architecture, everything had symbolism. If you go into those old cathedrals and whatnot in Europe, everything everything has symbolism. Everything points to something. As somebody who grew up in a non-Lutheran, or not even what would you say, a liturgical, like Roman Catholic or whatnot tradition, I was more Baptist. You walk into if you grew up Lutheran, or you even grew up Roman Catholic and then became Lutheran, you don't realize, for Baptists or people from a more what you'd call low church tradition, everything we do here seems completely packed with meaning. Sometimes we don't always understand it, but even having little symbols on the sides of a pew, that's something that a lot of churches don't do. They don't have. So forth. And so, Lutherans never gave up the whole, liturgical art, liturgical, architecture things. They just basically, they said, okay, we're gonna follow the Lutheran Reformation. Our Roman Catholic churches are now Lutheran churches. They didn't really tear things down. They just basically said, okay, we're following this movement now. And so because of that, we kind of stand out in a lot of ways. And so very early on, then you have things like tapestries and hangings, and early on in churches, the idea was to brighten up dark interiors. Sculptures and paintings were commissioned. We can think of, the Sistine Chapel, Leonardo da Vinci. I almost thought I said Leonardo DiCaprio. Da Vinci's Last Supper. Lutherans were far from those who rejected the use of art. Luther himself, in the preface of the Wittenberg hymnal in 1524 said, I am not of the opinion, as are the heterodox, heterodox basically means those who are teaching things in error, that for the sake of the gospel all arts should be rejected and eliminated. Rather, I feel strongly that all the arts, and particularly music, should be replaced in the service of him who was created and given them. So that Lutherans kept all these things. In fact, this was a big issue for many at that time, is that Luther and the Lutheran reformers said, we're going to keep, as long as it doesn't teach something false, we're going to keep art. We're going to keep the statuary. We're going to keep the elements of architecture, such as having an altar, so forth. We're going to keep those things. But on the other side of things, there was a movement within the Reformation that formed called the Reformed, and they believed that any depiction of Christ was idolatry. So they got rid of the crosses. Any picture of Christ so if you go, the heirs of this now are Presbyterians. Now some of the more liberal-minded ones have included things like stained glass and so forth, like that. But if you go to a Presbyterian church that they're really serious about being Presbyterian, you'll go in and there will not be a thing on the wall. They completely redesigned architecture to turn their churches more into lecture halls than what had previously been done before. The reason being is they didn't want statues. Statues were idolatry, so they knocked out the stained glass. So if you go to Europe, you'll sometimes hear some of these cathedral tours, oh, well, this isn't the original stained glass. It was knocked out. They basically was knocked out during the 1500s, and that's usually what happened. There was a time called the Peasant Revolt, and the peasants and other people just came through and just basically ransacked the churches, breaking anything that they could because it was seen as idolatry. But Lutherans, especially Luther, during that time, because he was alive and reacted very heavily to this, said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to, use a modern term, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so, not only is architecture and all this ways in which what we believe is influenced by the places we worship, so forth, but it's also a matter of gospel. A church that is interested in proclaiming the gospel also is interested in architecture. Year after year, the architecture of a church proclaims a message that either augments and proclaims the word or conflicts with it. Architecture and theology often go hand in hand. Architecture communicates stuff, whether it's just how the church is set up, or what kind of images or banners or even artwork that is in the place. Winston Churchill once said that we shape our buildings, and then our buildings shape us. So these are I think one of the things we've lost as we don't make buildings like we used to. We don't in the church, but just in general. We make buildings to be practical, to be functional. Whereas you go back even you go back to a certain time, and they wanted things to be practical, functional, but they also wanted things to be beautiful and and to say something. And so the church is first and foremost God's people gathered around word and sacrament. You might have heard the church is not a building; it's people. Well, that's very much true. The church is first and foremost the people of God gathered around word and sacrament. Whether that's in a really nice building or a really nice church building, or a really ugly one, or if it's on battlefield led by a chaplain, or it's in a park or anywhere. The church is first and foremost God's people. But we do speak of churches as specific places, and we don't. Sometimes I think we make too much. While it is the primary function of the church is first and foremost the gathering of people around word and sacrament, sometimes there's some Christians who get really, really bent out of shape if you refer to a building as a church. Well, let's not fall off the other side of the horse. For centuries, the reality is that we have referred to buildings from which people gather around word and sacrament as churches, or a church building. This is not something that's out of the blue. If you look in the Old Testament describes the preparation and ornamentation and arrangement of the tabernacle, the careful building requirements of the temple, even the elaborate furnishings of these places of worship were designed to send a significant message to the worshipers. Maybe I'm alone in this. Well, I like pretty things or beautiful things, and then things. I like whether that's we like to go out in nice views. We go for a hike and here's a nice view. We don't naturally naturally move towards something because that's ugly. I really like that. That's just hideous or something like that. There's something in the human nature that recognizes that buildings there's some beauty to architecture and buildings, and there's beauty to nature and so forth, and we as human beings, we appreciate those things. In the New Testament, on the story of the Transfiguration, Jesus, if you recall, Peter, James, and John, they see Jesus on the mountain in the Transfiguration, see Moses and Elijah, and their instinct is, we got to build a house for them. We got to build a place for them to dwell. Now, Jesus he just outright ignores the proposal, but he doesn't reject it either. So in the early days of the church, until 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, Christians met in the temple and in Jerusalem, and then others, because obviously the temple in Jerusalem was one particular location, and that they also met in synagogues. That changed about 70 AD, because when the temple was destroyed, they couldn't do there, and over time, the Jews became much, much more antagonistic towards Christians. It basically said, well, you can't meet in our synagogues anymore. And so all kind of side by side. They were meeting in the temple, they were meeting in synagogues, but they were also meeting in homes, and especially once they were no longer allowed to be in, the synagogues, they went to homes. And this is kind of where you get the idea of, home churches. Has anybody ever heard of that? And they've made a big comeback in the last 50 years, like the idea of a home church or a house church, so forth. Coming from kind of a Baptist evangelical background, they were really, really popular, but they kind of get it all wrong, because the kind of the modern idea is like, we're not going to have a formal religion, we're not going to have a big church building, we're just going to sit around and we're going to play a guitar around the coffee table, have very, very casual. But that's not actually how the early churches in houses actually worship. They didn't just have people come in and just sit around the equivalent of the living room. Rather, what happened is houses in those times were complexes, and so a wealthy family would say, "Okay, we're going to have in the East Wing," and they would actually set up a designated what we would call in that part of the house from which the church would meet. So it was far more closer to what we understand, even now, to what we understand as a modern, understand nowadays, the church building, than what's often kind of described in the kind of the modern house church movement. So some of the first signs and evidence of Christian art and architecture was wall paintings. In early Christian churches, the first Christians met in homes after they were rejected by the synagogues. And so they just started to, they painted biblical scenes and all this kind of stuff in their places of worship. And especially in those early days, the walls of those churches displayed depictions of, they were just wall to wall. People, biblical people, Adam, Eve. Has anybody ever been in like an Eastern Orthodox, like a Greek or Russian Orthodox church or Armenian or anything like that? Yeah. Well, what's one of the things you notice when you go into a church like that? There's not a space on any wall, including the ceiling, that is not painted with images of Christ or images from the Bible. Wall to wall, everything is painted. And that's a very early. They've kind of retained that early way of artwork and artwork in the church. I was there. I went to the Greek festival like 2 weeks ago downtown. It was held at the Greek Orthodox Cathedral, and they had the chapel open, and yeah, a lot of the time you can see them when you go to some of these ethnic festivals like Greek festivals or Russian, or a lot of the time they'll do that. I encourage just basically to see it in order to see it, because it's impressive. There's some aspects of their worship that I don't, especially how they understand images, that I don't agree with, but I can agree with the beauty and the kind of a lot of it is biblical imagery and Bible stories. Yeah. 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 So yeah, you have them on one side, and then you have the Reformed on the other side, where not an image in sight. Where was I? Yeah, and so by the 11th, that was kind of the earliest, is they just painted the walls. And then around the 7th century, artwork began to appear behind the altar. You ever been to? You don't really see it out here, because most of even our Lutheran churches out here are relatively new. But if you go more east into Lutheran churches, one of the things you'll notice is there's a lot of the time is there's the altar, and then there's usually a big, what they call an altar piece. Sometimes it might be a picture of Jesus. Sometimes it might be a statue of Jesus, or even a crucifix, so forth. And so by the 11th century, people began to build these kind of elaborate altar pieces. And sometimes, especially those early ones, they would fold in and out. So you'd have it folded in like this during a green season, and then it's like, oh, it's Advent. You fold it out, and it's a completely different picture that's to do with Advent or Christmas. So they don't really do them anymore. There's a LCMS artist named Ed Rehaus. He's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I mean, he's an example of one of the few actual modern Lutheran church artists that we have. He does paintings, he does altar pieces, he does everything. But he made this beautiful, beautiful altar piece for Our Savior Lutheran Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, they're a very modern building, but they took this idea and like, okay, we have to build a church, and it's 2010, but we also wanted to be a church, so they basically had him commissioned this artist to basically decorate their church, and he built this beautiful altarpiece in that old style where you have panels that flip out and it changes depending on you can change out how it looks depending on the time of the year. Where was it? Yeah, and so by the 11th century, you started to you got these altar pieces. You start to see more statues and whatnot. Especially if you go to Europe, you'll notice, in comparison to say the Russian or the Greek churches where everything's painted, by the Middle Ages, carving, stone or wood or so forth, became much more common. And of course, one of the big major themes, reasons for having such elaborate pictures and statuary in buildings was people were illiterate. People couldn't go home and read their Bible. So they wanted to just kind of inundate and be the church not just simply where that met, but the church to actually be didactic, that is, the church itself could teach the people, teach people the stories, so forth. One element you have in a lot of churches, and this is the case of the church we remember at in San Diego, Grace Lutheran, which is one of the few really old church buildings in the Lutheran church buildings in the western states. It's over 100 years old, but it's all done in the old kind of Spanish style, is they have a very long sanctuary, and on one side is all these small stained glass windows. Over here's the New Testament. You have the mirror side. It's all basically each window goes through the entire Old Testament, and that's one. You'll even see these in a lot of these old churches in Europe, and you'll still see them even in many of our older Lutheran churches out east today. And as Luther himself said and affirmed, and he said that children and simple folk, or just even regular adults, are more apt to retain the divine stories when taught by pictures and parables, and not merely by words and instructions. I mean, I think we all kind of recognize this today. A lot of us are visual people, and so if we just simply, like the Reformed, say, "Hey, we're going to have nothing, just hear the word." Now, the word, God's promises are attached to the word, and they're not necessarily to pictures and stuff like that, but they can actually aid in our understanding and retention of God's word in that respect. And one of the things that happened very early on was the people would meet for the Lord's Supper and other things, and, well, that requires dishes. It requires cups. It requires this. And so the very early Christians, when they had the Lord's Supper, often they would use the common household things that they had. But we actually see very early on that while at the beginning they did that, very early on they began to actually use metallurgy and so forth to actually create and build plates and cups and all these implements that were specifically set apart for the Lord's Supper. Very early on, you have very elaborate gold encrusted cups and all this kind of stuff. Now, why would they, since they started out just having regular, common everyday things, why would they change that? Why would they suddenly spend what would be like thousands or even thousands and thousands of dollars to have something made when they could have just used whatever they had in the cupboard? Well, it's the body and blood of Christ. This is it, Christ. Now, God does not command that God never commanded, oh, it has to be in gold and silver and it has to have this or that. But what we believe affects how we worship and the things we do in worship. So they had the right. The Bible, this is my body, this is my blood. That's a biblical truth. That is a thus saith the Lord, I like to say. The implication of that for them was, okay, if this is if this is the body and blood of Christ, isn't it appropriate to treat it as something special by having special cups and special plates and all this stuff that are specifically designed for that. And so very early on, they metallurgy and making cups and all that kind of stuff for this. Of course, by the early Middle Ages, the Vikings really liked that because they, when they were raiding England and France and all that, they'd come across these churches that would have all this gold and silver and all this there, and made them very happy too. So that, like I said, what we believe, and the church from the very very early had a saying, which was how lex orandi, lex credende, which means how you what you believe affects how you worship. It's a very old saying. What you believe affects how you worship. And so then you get into the whole idea of liturgical, of symbols. We see this, we have a lot here, but you can go you can get them all over the place. Like you see, we don't have any right now. Alpha and omega. That's the A, and then what looks like almost like a horseshoe. Do we have it over there? No, we don't. Actually, I'm going to turn that on because we're going to talk about some of this. So alpha and omega. I wish it's one of the things where I wish I actually had a white. The one drawback to having this in the sanctuary is I don't have a whiteboard. But yeah, you'll see like the A and what almost kind of overlapping it, what looks almost like a little like almost horseshoe type of pattern. That's basically the equivalent of A and Z. In the Greek alphabet, alpha and omega. So that comes from like the fact that in Revelation 18 and 21, God's referred to as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And that just basically is so early Christians read Revelation, and they start to use this symbol to indicate that part of the Bible, Alpha and Omega. Jesus is the beginning and the end. And so you see that all, it's a pretty common symbol. I was in here yesterday trying to take note of all the symbols for today, but that was one I couldn't find. Another one you see a lot sometimes is a loaf of bread, which represents the presence of Christ in the sacrament of the altar. It also just can represent kind of thanksgiving, God's what's the word? God's basically care for us. Then you have the chi rho. That's this here. The chi rho. That's basically, these are a little bit more ornate. This is designed to kind of, I think, have a bit more of an feel of a shepherd's crook, and some of them do that. But a lot of them sometimes just look like almost like a P that hasn't completely just connected at the end, at the loop. Chi rho. Basically, this is Jesus. So Jesus' name in Greek is said in Greek would be Jesus Christos, and so shorthand often was. So again, this is why I wish I had a. So the first two letters of Christ in Greek would be X, and then that slightly elongated P. That would be like the equivalent of a CHR in an English alphabet. And so early on, to abbreviate this, the name of Christ, they just used those two symbols. And over time, they kind of maybe stylized it and dressed it up more, but literally it just means Christ. It's also why in my early days, I always remember at Christmas time, everybody getting, certain Christian types getting always bent out of shape by people writing Xmas, saying, oh, they're trying to take Christ out of Christmas. No, they're not. They've been doing that for about 2,000 years, because that X literally just is the first letter of Christ's name in Greek. The early Christians used that as an abbreviation almost from the very beginning, and so that's why we use that. That's why it's not that people are trying to take Christ out of Christmas. If so, they've probably been trying to take Christ out of Christmas before there was even Christmas being celebrated. So yeah. Well, and of course, there's also the idea of a crucifix or a cross. In 1 Corinthians 1:23, it says that we preach Christ and Him crucified. Many people think that like a crucifix or anything like that that's a Roman Catholic symbol. See, I was a young, naive Lutheran convert who came into a church a Lutheran church that was not afraid of crucifixes. We had them in spades, including a big one right over like where this one here is. This cross here is. And so I was usher one day, and we had a visitor, and she's like, "Why do you have that crucifix up there?" And I'm like, "Well, we're Lutheran. Why wouldn't we?" Because I had never really been. There's some Lutherans that think that's a Roman Catholic symbol. I'm like, "Well, I don't know. That we're Lutheran." And then over time, as I became more knowledgeable of these things, I realized that some Lutherans believe that was, I've been taught that that's a Roman symbol. But here's actually the funny thing, is when you actually dive into history, crucifixes in the worship space, a Lutheran thing that the Roman Catholics took. So, of course, crucifixes and stuff like that, and crosses very early on. But Rome, if you walked into a Roman church up until 100 or so years ago, you walk into the church, you would never see something like this, or even an actual big crucifix above the altar. No, you'd walk in, and what you'd see is usually a big altar piece depicting the life of the saints. You'd see a big altar piece, especially if that church was like Saint Francis, or usually especially if it was the patron saint of that congregation that was named after. You wouldn't see a crucifix. In the Reformation, Lutherans became known as the ones who used the crucifixes. So let's say you're visiting Magdeburg, Germany in the 1500s, and you're like, well, where are we going to go to church today, honey? Well, I don't know. Let's go. Well, I don't know where any of the Lutheran churches are. Well, let's walk in here. Oh, you come in. Oh, there's the life of the saints. No, this is a Catholic church. Let's go down here. And you go, and I'm like, oh, you peek in. Oh, there's a crucifix up here. Oh, this is a Lutheran church. That's because Lutherans emphasized Christ and Him crucified. Jesus died on the cross, dies for your sin. He dies for your sins. That's a focus. That's a huge part of what Lutherans taught. And so to them, the crucifix was the symbol that kind of just drove that home. So it wasn't until till much later when during a lot of the kind of the worship reforms of the Roman Catholic Church that you start to see in the Roman Catholic churches the crucifix becoming much more of a central figure. So we're getting pretty close. So any thoughts, questions, or anything I've said so far? Mild heckling. Yeah. Yeah.
Lord's Supper. Could you also, bring in, besides being reverential and having something special, or one of the precious metals and things like that?
Well, here's the thing, and then you get sometimes people who have the right idea in mind, who want to try to be critical of the fact that you use precious metals and you have very ornate things in a church, and say, well, what about all the people who are homeless on the streets? Couldn't you be using that money to go towards that? And the church has always been front line, taking care of the poor, the needy, and all this kind of stuff. But now you remember, Mary, she. Under the table, with with basically the perfume, which would have been very, very, very and she's basically using it on Jesus' feet, and Judas. We very rarely remember that this was Judas who said this. Says a similar thing. She's using this expensive perfume, and says, she's using this expensive perfume, and says, couldn't this be used to, for the poor or something like that? And Jesus' response, you only have me here for a little while. He actually commends her, what she had to show reverence and respect and love towards him. And throughout history, using those precious metals and all this kind of stuff and having beautiful buildings is the same extension of that. Now, we never want to be doing those things to the neglect of, our neighbor, because the greatest commandment isn't make as beautiful buildings as you possibly can, or listen, love God and love your neighbor. But there's also love God there too, and that's one way in which we. Historically, churches and Christians have always shown their love for God is in using precious metals and architecture and art and all these things to elevate. I kind of lost track of your original question. Hopefully I answered.
No, good question. I it's also showing, obviously, the gift is immeasurable, so you're showing value towards the gift of salvation.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions? We've come to the end. Yes, John. And there's a very, very close example of what we believe affects how we do things, how we build our buildings and so forth. And John or one of the other older members might be able to speak more to this, because when I first came here, Pastor Traster mentioned that the design of the building was meant to kind of have the feeling of the ark. Is that correct, or was he telling me lies? No. Yeah. Yeah. Different eras always had different ways of doing things. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, and there's no problem with that. Like what I was talking about, there tended to be a kind of a big movement, especially in like the '60s, usually with kind of the hippies, to like not just simply, hey, we're going to meet in at homes. Meeting in homes is fine. The church has always done that, but they kind of push like, oh, we have to meet in homes, because the early church met in homes, without really understanding how the early church met in homes. Oh yeah. Well. I promised. We all promised to make sure that we were all the Sunday school classrooms are done around the same time. So we're now there. So let us end, and we'll say the Lord's Prayer. And if you have any thoughts, questions, you can talk to me afterwards. So let's pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. I'll see you around.